Good morning, everyone. If you could kindly please take your seats, we'll start in about a minute. Good morning, everyone. We will begin our meeting. This is the fourth meeting of this term of the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee. We'll begin with a roll call. I'll turn to the committee coordinator.
Councillor Bradley.
Here.
Councillor DeRoche.
Here.
Councillor Dudas.
Ici.
Councillor Devine.
Here.
Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Councillor Johnson.
Here.
Councillor Kelly. Councillor Luloff.
Présent.
Conseillère Plante. Vice Chair Hill.
Present.
And Chair Brockington. You have quorum, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Committee Coordinator. I did receive a note from Councillor Plante that she will be a bit late, stuck in traffic, but she will be here as soon as possible. Before we begin today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that today at 11 a.m. is the funeral for OPP Sergeant Eric Mueller, who was shot and killed while responding to a call in Bourget, just east of Ottawa. Two other officers, Marc Lauzon and François Camache Asselin, were also injured in the same incident. This is a very difficult time for many of our emergency response colleagues, in particular police. And I want to extend my respect and gratitude to these dedicated police officers. Our prayers and thoughts are with family, friends, and colleagues of Sergeant Mueller today. I would also like to recognize that since we last met, we have had spring flooding in the city. This has been a difficult time for many along the Ottawa and Rideau rivers, and I would like to thank staff, volunteers, my council colleagues, and residents for their dedication and hard work. Ça a été une période difficile pour beaucoup des résidents le long des rivières Outaouais et Rideau, et je tiens à remercier le personnel de la ville, les bénévoles, mes collègues de council et les résidents pour leur dévouement et leur travail acharné. We know that there is still much to do for those who have faced flooding on their property, and the cleanup is certainly not over. Last week was Emergency Preparedness Week, May 7th to 13th. And the theme this past year was Be Prepared, Know Your Risks. Le thème de 2023 est Soyez prêts, connaissez vos risques. Unfortunately, our residents are very aware of the risks, but there is always more that we can learn and different ways to prepare for different kinds of emergencies. There were a number of activities and information shared with residents, and it's a good opportunity for all of us to remind everyone to be ready. Today on our agenda, we have the 911 annual report. In addition to Beth Gooding's presentation, we have Inspector Russell Lucas and Eric Janis of the Ottawa Police Service to answer questions. Out of respect for our police partners and with the will of committee, I would like to move that the 911 annual reports be first on our agenda this morning. Thank you. The presentation will provide an overview of the 911 service in Ottawa, the contract, and the performance metrics of 2021 and 2022. This is an essential service, and while no one wants to have to make the call to 911, when you do, there is a friendly voice at the end of the phone to help. Following this, Beth Gooding will provide a verbal update on the ice storm recovery and present the 2021 and 2022 annual reports for the service. The report outlines the activities of the Public Safety Service throughout 2021 and 2022, including its most recent performance metrics, details on programs and emergency response related initiatives. Despite a challenging few years, the service was able to maintain its program requirements and is looking forward to moving forward with some strategic projects. So at that time, with the overview, we will continue with our agenda and note if there are any declarations of interest. If there are any declarations of interest from any committee member. Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes. Meeting number 3 from the 20th of April. Are those meeting minutes carried? Thank you. Okay, with the will of the committee, we will go to item 5.3, which is the 911 annual report 2021 and 2022. And I'll turn to General Manager Ayat.
Good morning, Chair, and thank you very much. Today we'll be presenting the Public Safety Services and 911 2021-2022 annual reports. I'm very proud of the work of the Public Safety Service throughout 2021 and 2022. Je suis très fier du travail réalisé par le service de sécurité publique tout au long du 21 et 22, des années 21 et 22. It's been a busy couple of years with multiple activated responses to emergencies and adapting to the changing realities of the work environment, all while maintaining program requirements and the changing demand for service. The Office of Emergency Management spent 21 and 22 dealing with a record number of days in heightened awareness for emergencies, and in some cases dealing with more than one emergency at any one time. Corporate security in 2022 saw a return to pre-pandemic levels of activities at city facilities. Corporate radio also saw an increase in activity over the last 2 years, with more than 7,000 radios now registered on the network. All of this and so much more are highlighted in these reports. Staff do this with dedication and the well-being and safety of residents of Ottawa in mind. Thank you to all for their hard work and their dedication. Le personnel accomplit son travail avec dévouement, ayant au cœur le bien-être de sécurité des résidents d'Ottawa. Je vous remercie de tous les efforts et de sa serviabilité. Beth Gooding, Director of Public Safety Services, will also present on the 911 2021-22 annual report today. The service agreement is managed by the City of Ottawa through the Public Safety Service. 911 is a vital service to residents of Ottawa and operators and their support and to support everyone who calls. Le 911 est un service essentiel pour les résidents d'Ottawa. Pour les proposés sont là pour appuyer les appelants. Beth will present today on the performance metrics of this agreement and will give the general overview of how 911 works in Ottawa. Thank you to staff for their work to maintain the service of residents, to residents, and to those who are there to take the call when it's needed. And now over to Beth for the presentation.
Okay, thank you. We can go to the next slide for the agenda. Just wanted to quickly highlight that since it's the first time that we're bringing the 911 annual report to committee, we'll be just spending a couple of minutes at the outset to explain how 911 works in Ottawa. And then we'll do our usual annual report highlights and look ahead. Next slide. So 911 in Ottawa. The city is the 911 authority, and we contract the initial call triage function to the Ottawa Police Service. We've had that arrangement in place actually since 1988. It predates amalgamation. And it is the norm, not only in the province, but across Canada. Most jurisdictions have their police service as the primary public safety answering point. In terms of the 911 Comms Bureau, it's located at 474 Elgin Street, and it's staffed by civilian members of the Ottawa Police Service. The manager is Eric Janis, who's here today, and his boss is Inspector Russell Lucas beside me. So a couple of things I wanted to highlight, which I think is really important. I always want to take the opportunity to thank and appreciate the 911 operators because they work in such challenging conditions and do such a great job. They're such a critical component of the emergency services system in Ottawa. And so I just wanted to thank them. I think the rest of the slide is pretty straightforward. I just wanted to, je voulais souligner quelque chose. Donc, à la réunion du 30 mars, conseillère Plante a indiqué que son arrondissement avait probablement le niveau le plus élevé d'appel au 911. Et ça, c'est fort probable, mais on n'a pas actuellement les moyens de vous donner un bilan précis par arrondissement. Quand on va faire la transition au service 911 de prochaine génération, on aura accès à des capacités GPS et à ce moment-là, ça sera possible de vous fournir des renseignements plus précis, quoi. So basically, et on va en parler davantage à la fin de la présentation, but I just wanted to highlight that when we transition to next generation 911, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end, we'll have more precise geolocation capabilities. And at that point, we'll be able to do things like provide statistics by ward, which we can't do right now. Next slide. So these are the main stakeholders in Ottawa. I've already talked about the first two. I just wanted to mention here that our two main secondary public safety answering points are Ottawa Fire Services and Ottawa Paramedic Service. Now, the Ottawa Paramedic Service for the 911 technical function operates under the leadership of the Provincial Ministry of Health. And that becomes important when we talk about next generation 911, because they'll be transitioning under the province, whereas police and fire are transitioning as part of the city. Next slide. So we've included this slide here to highlight what is in scope for the service level agreement between the city and Ottawa Police Service and what is out of scope. This slide is actually out of scope, but I'll explain that. So a couple of slides ago, we showed that when a caller calls 911 in Ottawa, they'll be asked if they need police, fire, or paramedics. And the operator, the caller will identify what their need is, and the operator's objective is to transfer to the agency required as fast as possible. So that's the limit of our service level agreement with the Ottawa Police Service, just that small function. The actual response dispatch is outside of the scope of our agreement, but obviously there are synergies between the calls made to 911 and the response dispatched. And so this is a good example of that. And it pertains to some of the statistics in our report. So you might have seen in the report that in 2022, 3% of calls made to 911 were transferred to Ottawa Fire Services. So that seems quite low, but it's not a reflection in any way of the amount of response that Fire Services does every day across the city. And there's different reasons for that, including tiered response. So tiered response is an agreement that the emergency services have in place with each other that basically denotes that the lead responding agency can and should call other emergency services for support as required. And there's specific scenarios under which they must do so. So just to give you a quick example, Ottawa Police Service is the lead on traffic accidents within the city. But if they get to the site and see that an extrication is required, they'll call Ottawa Fire Services and Fire Services will come and do the extrication. But our statistics only show police as the response to that call. We aren't able to quantify the tiered response from Ottawa Fire. So that's why I just wanted to explain, because our report may look a bit off in that regard. Next slide. Okay, so the service level agreement was renewed most recently in 2022, and it only covers about 2 years, because we know that when we transition to next generation 911, the terms and conditions will need to change a little bit. And the service level agreement basically highlights some of the requirements that we expect from the police service, including operator training and things like that. It also includes performance metrics. In terms of some high-level highlights, as you can see from this chart, calls to 911 are steadily increasing. The only outlier year was 2022, which was almost certainly a result of the pandemic closures. Oh, sorry, 2020. Sorry about that. Thanks, Kim. Let me see if there's anything else. The other thing I wanted to mention is that very few calls now are made to 911 over a landline. In 2022, only 7% of calls made to 911 were over a landline. The vast majority are made by cell phone. Et je voulais aussi souligner le fait qu'en 2022, on a reçu environ 350 000 appels au 911, mais on a reçu juste 10 plaintes cette année et les plaintes étaient plutôt de nature administrative. Donc, pour moi, c'est vraiment l'épreuve de la qualité des agents embauchés par le service de police d'Ottawa. Il faut vraiment du bon travail, quoi. Next slide. So these are the key performance metrics that we track. We can confirm that over the past 2 years, the Ottawa Police Service has consistently had a sufficient number of agents on call every day, and that they adjust their staffing in response to the context of the situations they're facing. Just as a quick example, during the April freezing rainstorm, I was talking to Eric Janis because there was an uptick in calls to police as the day progressed, primarily related to road safety, fallen branches and that kind of thing. But he was able to upstaff in the 911 center by having some of his day shifts stay on to do overtime at night, you know, so yeah. So the one statistic that has not been met over the past 2 years is the third one, which is the call response statistic. So we did want to talk about that, and we wanted to mention a couple of things here. So the City of Ottawa has a very strict service standard, much stricter than what you'll see in other jurisdictions and much stricter than the National Emergency Number Association standard, which we have on the slide here. So having said that, though, the Ottawa Police Service, up until recently, has consistently met that 97%. And so this is an important discussion. The other thing that's important to note is that this service standard is a problem in most jurisdictions across Canada right now. I think that in our annual report, we cited a couple of examples related to GTA and Peel region. There are different reasons in different jurisdictions. And we're doing the analysis here to really hone in on the problem. There are a couple of factors here that are important to know. One of them is that the Ottawa Police Service has been very good at incorporating and adopting the equipment necessary to move to next generation 911 quite early. And so they've been implementing that new equipment while working in the old system. And so we think that there are some data integrity issues as a result that need to be resolved. And we're also looking at some operational measures that we might be able to pilot over the next little while to see if they have a positive impact. And so this is a statistic that we'll be working on with the Ottawa Police Service, and we'll be reporting back to this committee at the next annual report. Next slide, please. So next generation 911. It's hard to believe, but our current system has been in place for over 30 years. And so it definitely does require a refresh. All jurisdictions in Canada are mandated to upgrade to next generation 911 by March 4th, 2025. And what it is basically an end-to-end digital system. So it's internet protocol based. And what that means is that eventually callers will be able to do things like real-time texting with operators. They'll be able to send pictures and video. It's just not capable right now with the technology that we have. And as I mentioned earlier, we will, under this new system, have more precise geolocation data. I sort of a couple of seconds ago used the wrong word when I said that it was an upgrade, because what it really is a change management initiative. Not only is it a whole new technology system, but there are requirements related to operator training, new policies, procedures, cybersecurity, public engagement. And so this is a big initiative for the city. And we are working very closely with the Ottawa Police Service, Ottawa Fire Services, and the Ottawa Paramedic Service to make sure that there's a smooth transition over the next couple of years. And again, this is an item that you'll see us report on regularly through the annual report. And maybe that's a good segue to the next and last slide, which is just a look ahead for us. It basically summarizes what I just said, which is that we are working with the Ottawa Police Service on the that one performance metric. And we're putting a framework in place to make sure that we have the right project management approach for the next generation 911 transition. We have a formal governance structure to manage this within the city. It's chaired by GM Kim Ayot, and it includes all the key partners. And it's really critical for us to make sure that this is closely managed going forward. And I think that's our last slide. The last slide actually just is another thank you to the 911 operators for the great job that they do. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Gooding, for your presentation. And we do have questions from committee members. However, before we do that, we do have a delegation on this item. Mr. Wood, I would call on yourself. Welcome back, Mr. Wood. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Just press the button in front of you. But there you go.
I only owned an audiovisual company for 10 years, so thank you very much to everybody on committee for asking me to be here this morning. I truly appreciate it. It's been a tough time the last 3 years. When I was here last time, I talked about some of the challenges that my family's been facing. I'm going to continue forth. I did read the report on 911, and as technology continues to evolve, next generation 911 is coming, which is a good thing for everybody, right? And so here's the challenge. I've brought some notes, and the post-secondary educator in me is going to put them aside for a second and just talk real here. Again, last week, I received end-of-life messages from a family member, and I cannot call 911 here in Ottawa and be transferred to Toronto. And so when I called Toronto non-emergency, because the system in 2023 does not allow for the call to be able to be transferred, I'm on hold for an hour plus. This time I was on hold for an hour and 20 minutes. So the one thing that I do want to discuss with everybody, because I'm sure everybody has children in here, I am a post-secondary educator, and this semester that just finished, I have never received as many mental health emails from students in my 16 years of being there. And I want you just to think inward for a moment and think that if your child was at Humber College, University of Toronto, and they sent you a note at 11 o'clock at night saying that they no longer want to continue living, your first reaction would be to call 911. And you will quickly find out that they cannot transfer the call to get police and paramedics there. And that is a challenge for many people, not only in our city, but in our province and our country. Having said this, yesterday I was fortunate enough to have the president of the Ontario Treasury Board, Minister Prabmeet Sarkaria, send me a message saying, I want you to come to Toronto. I want you to meet with us June 6th. So I'm on my way to Toronto to meet with the Commissioner of Emergency Management and Minister Prabmeet Sarkaria and other ministers within the Ontario government to help support the city to get 911 updated faster. If we think about it, I understand that Ms. Gooding was talking about next generation 911 and texting and video, which is great, and we need that. This is the world we live in now. But at the very basics, we should be able to get a call transferred to emergency services. I did put something on social media, and this was interesting for everybody, I believe here. I had a reporter, a journalist, send me a note saying that they were in Calgary in 2019. A friend of theirs had posted similar messages to what I've described on social media. She called from her mother's house. She was visiting her mother in Calgary. She called 911 from a landline in Calgary and asked to be transferred to Ottawa, and she was. So I understand that the technology could very well be analog here in Ottawa. Toronto could be analog. All of Ontario could be analog, while Alberta could be digital, and this is why it was sent to Ottawa 911 directly. So as we continue to move forward, and I continue to
1 minute.
thank you, sir, deal with family mental health. I'm also dealing with youth mental health. Every semester, I walk 5, 6, 7 students to counseling directly, because the last 2.5 years have put a tremendous amount of pressure on people. I think we're going to continue to see more people that need emergency response. And I'll just conclude by thanking Ottawa Police, Fire, paramedics for everything they do in this city. It's devastating that there's a funeral today. And I just want to give my utmost thanks to everybody in emergency services, everybody at 911, and everybody here on committee for giving me the opportunity to present and bring forward the challenges that many in our city are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Wood, and your advocacy for a modernized 911 system in particular. Are there any questions for the delegate?
Questions?
Okay, so to staff or the delegate? Okay, we'll park that for now. I just wanted to clear our delegate first, Mr. Wood. Seeing no questions, thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Okay, I do want to acknowledge and welcome Inspector Lucas. Thank you, sir, for being with us today as well, here to take questions or provide input. Should there be any questions for you from committee members? We do have a speaking list, and I will acknowledge Councillor Gower, if you could just mute, please. Councillor DeRoche first, and then Councillor Devine. Councillor DeRoche.
Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci pour la présentation. J'ai bien aimé que vous avez parlé en français aussi. Je pense qu'on a besoin de plus de français au comité. Alors, merci pour ça. 2 questions. Souvent, j'ai des questions dans mon quartier. J'ai beaucoup de rues qui sont ajoutées à chaque année. Alors, le réseau de rues augmente. Et les gens me disent parfois, « Oh, j'ai vu dans mon système GPS, je ne peux pas trouver mon adresse. » Alors, est-ce que le système d'urgence, est-ce qu'ils vont trouver mon adresse? Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour faire certain qu'on a toutes les rues incluses dans le système pour que les gens aient un service rapide?
Ok, merci pour la bonne question, Monsieur le Président. Oui, il y a un processus qui nous permet de faire une augmentation de notre donnée en tant que les rues, les parcs, les choses comme ça, chaque semaine. Et cette information est donnée au service de police d'Ottawa pour qu'ils puissent l'utiliser pour les réponses d'urgence.
Excellent, les gens vont aimer savoir cette information. My second question is on, and Councillor Hubie, you've raised this I think many times, where we'll hear from the public that there's a fender bender, they see it, and they see paramedic, fire, police, and I think the answer back was always that we find a way to triage this to make sure that we're efficient in the deployment. Obviously, you have to make some judgment calls in terms of what is a serious accident. But just wondering what work's being done there to ensure that we're not sending 10 vehicles when it's kind of a 2-vehicle problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the great question through you, Chair. Yeah, I think that over the years, it's an education campaign. Many of the accidents that occur, the public who are driving by may not see the fact that somebody is injured in the accident, requires stabilization and mobilization in the vehicle. The fact that the vehicles have been in an accident, they have to be, mechanically disabled, not just turn off the key, but we'll make sure that they don't move. There's also potential fire hazards that are associated. Again, whenever a vehicle's been in an accident, you might find yourself with a small flame somewhere and no one knows where that is. So it's important that we have our emergency services respond to them. As a matter of practice, they don't respond to all accidents. They only respond to accidents where there's an injury automatically or unless they're upgraded. It's all part of the tiered response agreement. It's reviewed annually or every second year to make sure that it's still accurate for what we do. And I know that we've heard from people wondering why there are so many resources at these scenes, and I can assure you that they're required based on the jobs that need to take place there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think sometimes perception's reality, so we have to, we have to communicate to the public in terms of how we're, how we're being efficient and how we're making sure that we have the right number of resources responding to a call. So. We'll probably keep talking about it in the years to come. But again, it's important information to reinforce to the public. So thank you, Chair. That's all for me.
Thank you, Councillor Delroche. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. Hello. I did have a bunch of questions about the 911 report, but I did want to just throw a couple questions out with regards to Mr. Wood, the delegate's concern about the nimbleness of 911. And I think I remember from his previous delegation, there was, we heard that the situation he's referring to, calling from Ottawa about, someone of concern in Toronto, that would be a slim minority of calls that R91 would ever receive. And so my first question, in our current form, if I was in Mr. Wood's situation and I called 911 and Ottawa Dispatch picks it up, could I say, I've got somebody in Toronto who is in jeopardy, can you please alert Toronto Police? Is that option within our current, what we can do?
So thank you, Chair, for the question. Right now, if you were to make that call to the Ottawa Police Service, they would give you the non-emergency response number for Toronto to call, which is what happened with Mr. Wood on both occasions, I believe.
And is it normal, is what Mr. Wood described as following that instruction and being on hold for an hour and a half with non-emergency police in Toronto, would that, in your estimation, be a normal outcome of our instruction?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. It's hard for me to comment on service standards in
Yeah,
Toronto, so but it sounds to me like that may be a bit long, to be frank.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wood was describing a different scenario in Alberta, I think I understood, where what he was eventually looking for could work within Alberta's system. As we migrate towards next generation 911, would the outcome that he's looking for be possible?
Yes, it's one of the, sorry again, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. It's one of the main benefits of next generation 911 is that when we go to internet protocol, we'll have the chance to be able to directly transfer calls at a minimum across the Bell network, which covers all of Eastern Canada up to Manitoba, I believe, but we think it'll be Canada-wide. So we're looking into that further.
Okay, thank you. So now I just wanted to focus in on the elements of the 911 report and specifically where we were measuring up in those performance standards. And I did notice, and so what I did, so as you were reporting, we have a very strict and ambitious performance standard. And I did notice in reviewing the report that other cities are not only falling off their own standards, as you indicated, but they're falling even further. It would seem that their performance measures are further. I appreciate the fact that we have a high standard. But I do note that, as you said, in the last 2 years, we're trending downwards. If we have set a higher standard, I would prefer that we aim to maintain a high standard rather than, let's say, degrading our standard. So a couple questions I have, just because I do want to, zero in on why perhaps we are trending downwards. Can we get a sense from OPS or from staff of what are the possible consequences of us falling further from that standard, i.e. what are the possible outcomes of us not being able to respond to a growing number of calls within 6 seconds? Paint a picture of what happens then.
So thank you, Chair. It's an interesting question, and it's hard for us to answer a hypothetical. What I think I might do to start is, because he has a great example related to traffic accidents, I'm going to ask Inspector Lucas to explain just a scenario that is fairly frequent that they see and that impacts that statistic in particular. So.
Thank you for the question. And I think it's an important one to ask. There's a whole bunch of different factors, and there's no one single cause. If there was, it'd be easier to address. So it's part of the reason we're taking a multifaceted look on how can we do better, because it doesn't matter even if we're running at 95%. We want to always strive to do better. They're calling us because they're having a life emergency that they need assistance in. So for us, it's being important to be responding to those calls. For the change in technology and things that have happened in society over the last 30 years ago, not everybody had a cell phone. So some of the things that we see, and it's only one factor that comes into play that we need to consider, is people drive by what is maybe a significant accident on the highway, and we'll get a deluge of 911 calls all at the same time. And so they can be driven by events. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just coincidence that things are happening across the city. But when we've had a serious accident, a lot of people may not stop, but they're doing the right thing by calling 911 and tell us there's an accident. So we may see a spike of 30 calls in within a matter of minutes that we're trying to answer. And we do get to all those calls, and when people don't get that answer within the 10 seconds, the minute or so, and if they hang up, those calls are logged, and we are calling those people back to ensure that they are safe, to find out what the emergency is, and to ensure that we are covering those bases. So we may not be achieving the objective we want of that immediate response, but we are following up on all those calls that are logged.
Thank you. And I know that you're working on a rationale, an explanation of why we are trending downwards. Is there a timeline for when that rationale might be delivered so we can get to the bottom of it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it will take us several months to assess the situation. There are different factors, including just more calls to 911.
Yeah.
Some jurisdictions are noticing that it is related to staffing. We're not sure that's the case here. We need to look into it further. So yeah, we expect to have something more to report probably in the fall.
Thank you. And I did notice in your report that one reason perhaps that there might be a dip in our performance standards is because a lot of the 911 calls are taking longer than a call might normally take. I'm trying to speculate of what those reasons might be. The delegate was talking about to an increasing number of mental health calls. Have you reached reasons of why the calls might be going longer? And if hypothetically it is related to mental health calls, are there other services that might take those calls? And
so thank you, Mr. Chair. So no, we haven't made that determination yet. And each call is kind of unique. And so it's hard for us to summarize globally. Thanks.
And my last question, in the report, I was noticing that in most of the tables, there was data from 2018 to 2022. In table 2, there was no data from 2018-19. I wasn't sure why. Is there a reason why there wasn't data on that table from those 2 years?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Do you recall what table that was? I'll just look it up here.
I remember it yesterday.
Oh.
It was table 2 in the report.
Oh. So we do, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we do have this data. I think that part of the reason that we didn't include it was simply for space in the report. But if you're interested, we can provide that to you after the meeting.
Yeah, I think just for the sake of, because if every other table is measuring, I believe it's 5 years or 4 years of data, for the sake of having a fulsome report, I wouldn't mind if I don't know how to go about this, if the data were included in the report post receiving, if that's a thing that we can do. I don't want to delay receiving the report. I would just like to see that every table has the same range of data.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we will follow up on that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Devine. Councillor Kavanaugh, you're next, and then Councillor Blanc.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. In terms of 911 updates, what about mental health calls? That is a trend we're seeing more and more. And are they be logged separately? Is there going to be the capacity to have mental health workers come in eventually to take those calls? I want to know if that's being looked at.
Thank you for the great question, Mr. Chair. So currently, the question you're asking is outside of the scope of our service level agreement with the Ottawa Police Service, which is really just that initial call triage. Do you need police, fire, or paramedics? Having said that, though, there is work being done under the direction of the Guiding Council, specifically to address the mental health response. And the Public Safety Service is part of those discussions because there may be direct or indirect implications to that initial call triage. We're not ready yet to report because the research is ongoing, but we can confirm that it's being looked at.
Okay, it's being looked at. Okay, that's helpful. I'm glad to hear that. This is a question you've heard many times in terms of people who live near the river, whose phone calls get directed to Quebec. That happens often. Is there any updates or information on that?
Thank you again for the question, Mr. Chair. So that happens often, including to me. And there's a strong protocol in place between Gatineau Police and the Ottawa Police Service. That is the one jurisdiction to which we can directly transfer 911 calls. It's sort of a function of geography. And so the operators know that if they get a call on the wrong side of the river, that they can transfer it right away. And as Inspector Lucas noted, they're very careful. They'll stay on the line, make sure the call was properly transferred, and that service is provided.
Okay, thank you.
Just on that note, if I may, Director, how many calls per year are we talking about volume-wise where Ottawa residents are picked up by a Gatineau operator and vice versa? How significant of an issue is this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an excellent question. I have not seen those statistics. I'm just going to look at Inspector Lucas. Do we collect that data?
Not that I'm aware of. I'd have to follow up with the operations manager to see if that's actually tracked, but I couldn't give you a definitive answer right now.
I'm interested just because of the extra time it takes for that call to be received, then transferred, then a re-engagement with the other municipalities' intended operator. So I'd like to see that data, if I may. Okay, Councillor Kavanaugh, that's all? Okay, Councillor Plante.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la présentation et shout out to conseiller Desroches pour sa question en français aussi. Nous, au centre-ville, comme vous savez, à cause d'un manque d'effectifs, il y a beaucoup de gens qui ont maintenant recours à du private security. J'en ai beaucoup au centre-ville, surtout avec l'Université d'Ottawa et le Centre Rideau. Et parfois, je leur demande leurs statistiques et on voit ici, j'ai juste un rapport devant moi, use of force, drugs, code of conduct, attempted burglary, theft, etc. Alors, il y a vraiment un genre de corps de police auxiliaire, disons, qui fonctionne dans le centre-ville où on a, je ne sais pas, on n'a vraiment pas de rapport et on n'a vraiment pas de statistiques qui peuvent nous aider à savoir qu'est-ce qui se passe relatif au centre-ville et à certains points parce que, comme l'Université d'Ottawa, je pense qu'il y a un corps de presque 40 à 50 effectifs autour du campus. Est-ce qu'il y a façon que, je ne sais pas si je dois vous contacter ou faire une demande, quoi que ce soit, qu'on peut harmoniser les statistiques parce que moi, je pense qu'on ne peut pas vraiment savoir qu'est-ce qui se passe au centre-ville sans qu'on ait une idée de qu'est-ce qu'on est tous en train de gérer et on ne peut pas mesurer qu'est-ce qu'on ne peut pas gérer.
Donc, merci pour la question, la bonne question, Monsieur le Président. Vous avez raison, c'est un peu compliqué. Il s'agit vraiment comme d'un système sécuritaire. Et en tant que l'Université d'Ottawa, il s'agit d'un organisme privé, donc on n'a pas accès à leurs données. Donc non, je dirais qu'on n'a pas vraiment les moyens de faire un bilan global de ce qui se passe au centre-ville.
Est-ce que peut-être que si on rassemble quelqu'un des joueurs dans cette situation, disons la sécurité à l'université, peut-être quelques des compagnies privées aussi, on pourrait peut-être faire une liste de demandes qu'on pourrait partager hebdomadairement, disons mensuellement, pour et honnêtement, je ne sais pas comment on peut juste mettre ça en relief, mais je voulais juste savoir si c'est possible qu'on peut en discuter.
Oui, merci, conseillère Plante, Monsieur le Président. I think what you'll see is right now we don't have the technical capabilities to identify by ward the calls, the types of calls, etc. Dans le futur, avec the Next Generation 911, on va être capable de faire geolocation, on va être capable de donner des rapports spécifiques à chaque région. C'est là d'où la différence va vraiment se passer. À ce moment, c'est très difficile de poigner tous les appels dans votre région comme vous le demandez. Ça répond-tu à la question?
Oui, mais comme si, par exemple, je vous donne un exemple. L'Université d'Ottawa, où c'est 5 compagnies privées, puis ils me donnent des statistiques harmonisées, ils ont tous les mêmes données. Je les donne à qui pour que ça soit comptabilisé dans les statistiques de la ville? Et si vous ne savez pas, c'est bien aussi, comme on peut en discuter à part aussi, oui.
C'est pas possible à ce moment, merci Monsieur le Président, c'est pas possible à ce moment de mettre ces statistiques-là dans le 911, mais je dirais peut-être un contact avec la police pour faire sûr que si ça fait d'affaires avec, if it deals with crime, then they'll probably want that information as well as part of their crime stats. But I can't speak for police, but the question is if, let's say, the University of Ottawa has statistics on all of their private security crime stats, how do they make sure that the city is aware of that and has that information? And my comment is that it's not part of the 911 system, but it may be part of a relationship with police for reporting that for crime stats. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Thank you for the clarification. That's correct. If it's crime stats, it would be coordinated with our own crime analysts and sharing that information. Most of our community officers are engaged with those, especially the key partners with transient communities like the different university and educational institutions for public safety.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, so if I am able to sort of get some of the big players on board, the sort of 5 or 6 big security companies, Ottawa, Rideau Center, who also they have their own security system, as I'm sure you know. If we can maybe get some statistics and then send them to you, I don't know if I'd send them to the crime analyst, will those be counted as sort of the overall statistical trends for, not just for Ward 12, but across the city? Or like, is it kind of just going into, because I was saying we sort of have an auxiliary police force operating in the downtown core. And I worry that all of the work they do, which is a lot of it is a bit like police work. They only sort of escalate calls if they absolutely have to. That's not being captured in terms of what's happening in the downtown core. And I want to make sure that we have statistics that can really reflect the help that we need.
Correct. As it is out of the scope for this, but the best person would be through our crime analyst to make sure that that the data provided is not duplication of where there's been a joint effort, but there is an opportunity there to ensure that that information get there, because that's important for us to know as well.
No, for sure. And so, yeah, if you could just maybe we could talk offline and you can tell me who I need to reach out to, I'd appreciate it. Merci.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to ask quickly about the strength of the system during large-scale events. So I remember back when the convoy rolled through Ottawa, there was at least one evening where our 911 system became overwhelmed and was not able to keep up with the calls. And it's my understanding that was a coordinated effort by all kinds of actors as part of the convoy. But I'm wondering, when a large scale event like a tornado hits the city and hits multiple wards and hundreds of people are calling 911 at the same time, does our system become overwhelmed, or would it take a coordinated event to do that? So how strong, what's the confidence in our 911 system when a tornado hits our city and destroys hundreds of homes and all of those people call 911 at one time? And would that be a human resources issue or a technology issue or both? And would the next gen system have any ability in bolstering that? Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so thank you, Chair, for the good question. I can start and then perhaps Inspector Lucas can add. I just wanted to make a point of clarity related to the example of the truck convoy. It wasn't so much the 911 system that got overwhelmed with spam calls, but more the police services non-emergency line, which is obviously easier to spam. In any case, the Comms Bureau at 474 Elgin, just like the rest of the city, has been through many, many emergencies, and they're very good at adjusting their posture to the context at hand, including by upstaffing and things like that. The city's own services are not able to provide direct support to 911 because it's a different system, different operator training, different operator protocols. But another good example is during the truck convoy, where our 311 operators were able to support with some of the non-emergency calls and to provide some surge there. And I'll just see if Inspector Lucas wants to add anything to my answer.
Just thank you for the question. I just want to reinforce what was said earlier, is that sometimes we do see those spikes, and when they do occur, those calls are tracked. So if they may not get the immediate response, but because those calls are tracked, we're able to call those people back to ensure that we are doing those follow-ups. When we're not able to get a response on those, then it becomes a dispatch where we do actually go to investigate a lot of those cases. So yes, there is on those events, so like the Roche that went through, there was a large spike in calls. They may not be as in-depth when they're taking the initial call to determine where it can be better triage. If it's about a down tree, maybe they can move that to another 311 in a more timely manner to be able to get to the next one, rather than spending more time on those calls to ensure they're getting as detailed information for a response. And they will do the management, and we will pivot as many resources we have available to us to ensure that we're doing those timely responses and doing those follow-ups to make sure that no calls basically been left unanswered.
Councillor Kelly, anything else?
Not immediately, no.
Okay. If I could, just before you, Councillor Love, Inspector, describe for us what's happening in the call center on a very busy day. When does the supervisor notice that all the operators are engaged? You have calls continuously coming in. How do you pivot to add resources? The report talks about a minimum number of operators. How do you make almost immediate adjustments to resources that you need if there's a very busy day? It doesn't necessarily mean a natural disaster, but it could be, traffic accidents plus other events. We've had a number of fires the last few days. How do you make those immediate changes?
Great question, Chair. And this is an opportunity to sell again the great work that those members are doing quietly behind the scenes that they really don't get recognized for. So there's a couple of different things that happen. The first is the scheduling is not, we have a day shift and an afternoon shift and a night shift. There is multiple start times and end times, and their scheduling is based on historic data of when our calls for service are. So you will see more people working during what we know are historical peak times based on known history. So that's one way in which we're addressing those issues. The second is that it's important to recognize that 911 and police dispatch, although they're two separate entities, they are co-housed together. So what will happen is people that are working, assisting with the dispatching and managing of the floor, we have the ability to pivot those resources from doing dispatch duties or supporting the dispatcher to answering 911 calls to get us through those peaks. And then we will return them back to their normal duties. If it becomes sustained and we're seeing things that are starting to go up or impacts, then we have the ability to do a message out to look for additional resources, people who want to come in over time to be able to adopt that. And again, speaking to the great work that they do, when those big events happen, we actually do get people, just like our emergency frontline workers, come into work regardless of whether they've been called or not, because they know the city needs them.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Councillor Lulaf.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to take a brief moment to laud the incredible work that our communications professionals do every single day. Oftentimes when we talk about our first responders and the great work that they do in our community, we neglect to mention that there's an incredible team of communications specialists that are doing this work as well. You know, their quick decisions help to save lives every single day. And Kim, I love it when the Emergency and Protective Services Group puts out photos of our communications professionals receiving those baby pins, because they've helped to talk somebody through delivering a baby, you know, on the side of the road, or where it may be difficult for staff to get to them in time. Sometimes we wait a little bit too long, I think, to call when we require an ambulance. But you know, also in very difficult times of level 0, these operators stay on the line and really help you know, calm you down and help get you know, bystanders doing the work in preparation for emergency and protective services to show up. So just thank you to all of them that are paying attention today. And if you don't mind passing that message along, we appreciate the work they do every single day. They're certainly part of the full first responding team, and we just appreciate them so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Excellent comments. Any other questions on this item? The motion before us is that the committee recommend council receive this report for information. Is this item received and carried? Thank you. General Manager, Director, and Inspector, thank you very much for your attention on this item. Okay, going back now to the original order of our agenda, item 4.1 is response to inquiries 2023-01 procedures that are in place for extreme weather events. This is a response to an inquiry that was submitted by Councillor Troster at the council meeting of February 8th, 2023. Does anyone wish to lift this item for discussion, or can we simply note it on our agenda? Noted.
I wanted to lift it, thanks.
Pardon me?
It's Lane Johnson, and I had asked to lift it yesterday.
Okay, very well. So you have questions now?
Yeah, I just had a couple questions about it.
Okay, I'll just ask the committee for their indulgence to lift this item. All right, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Johnson.
I just wanted to, so thank you very much for the indulgence. I wanted to ask if if staff could expand on the decision to, in extreme weather events, or not extreme weather events, pardon me, that's my bias showing, but extreme hot and cold events, to direct people down to the respite centers, the overnight centers that are centrally located. I represent a large ward in an outer urban area, and I wonder if there is an opportunity to consider how we might be able to support people closer to home, closer to work, closer to family. And I'd just like to understand, and I know I've spoken to staff about this offline, but whether we might consider expanding that list to include at least one center in the west end of the city. I think about Bell's Corners, you know, having such a remote area in the first place and having a lot of weaknesses in their systems. To travel downtown can be a challenge. And I want to know that we can, you know, think outside the box a little bit in how we create a caring community in these extreme hot and colds, because they are becoming more frequent.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm not sure who will take this. Director Gooding.
So thank you, Chair, for the excellent question. It is, to be frank, better directed at our colleagues at Community and Social Services Department, but I can comment that during extreme hot and cold, we have a partnership with the Salvation Army outreach van. There are 2 vans that will go 24/7 during these extreme weather conditions. And when they do their outreach, Councillor Johnson, they will offer transportation services as well to those that are interested in seeking relief from the weather at a respite center, for example.
Thank you. Yes, I do know that there is that transportation option, but I will hope to continue the conversation that we could decentralize some of these services in these hot and cold events, because we want to make it so that people have convenient options, whether they are, facing mobility challenges or other disabilities that require care services closer to home, or like there's a lot of reasons why, getting in a van and going somewhere else is not going to work for people in extreme hot and cold. And of course, extreme hot and cold directly relates to power outages. So I think that unfortunately we can't help but talk about both. And so when we're thinking about, hardening in some of our centers like the Nepean Sportsplex, I know we're hardening in with a generator, and thank you for the indulgence, Chair, that I'm blending these two things together, but I don't know how we can talk about them separately, frankly. Like if you have a power outage, you are more susceptible to hot and cold. So how we might imagine, in those circumstances, blending our supports with our larger emergency management for overnights that are decentralized. I think that's something we can think about. So I know Nepean Sportsplex is getting the full generator kit and caboodle soon, and that might be a suggestion, but we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions on this item? Okay, so we will move on then to item 5.1, which is a verbal update on the city's response to the April ice storm. Vice Chair Hill has a procedural motion to introduce so that we can receive this presentation and dispense with the need to have a follow-up report prepared by staff. So I'd like the Vice Chair to read his motion, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Be it resolved that the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee approve that the rules of procedure be waived subject to subsection 83(4)(a) of the procedure bylaw, being bylaw number 2022-410, to receive a verbal update on the city's response to the April 23 ice storm at today's meeting and dispense with the requirement for staff to provide a separate written report on this verbal update/presentation.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Is that motion carried? Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So we'll have the staff presentation, and we do have a delegation, the Executive Director of Volunteer Ottawa, which we'll hear after the delegation. So, the staff presentation will be first. So, Ms. Gooding.
Okay, thank you. So I will just briefly explain what happened during the freezing rain event and what the city did. So freezing rain was anticipated to start early the morning of Wednesday, April 5th, and the Office of Emergency Management, as well as other city services, began to informally monitor that the weekend before. It started off as a Public Works Department lead, which is normal. They declared a significant weather event and issued communications to explain how they were preparing for it. The Office of Emergency Management also worked with our Public Information and Media Relations team to issue some generic guidance to residents, including about the potential for power outages. So the freezing rain did start, as predicted, early the morning of April 5th. Je pense qu'il y a eu un peu plus de pluie verglaçante que prévu. Je pense qu'on a enregistré ici à Ottawa environ 30 à 35 millimètres, ce qui a eu comme résultat une accumulation de glace franchement partout, sur les routes, les trottoirs, les branches d'arbres. So we probably got a bit more freezing rain than expected, and it coated everything in ice. One of the first city impacts that we saw that morning was the 5 trains on Confederation Line, LRT, that became immobilized, and fire services helped with a safe evacuation. And that was due to an accumulation of ice on the overhead power lines. So Confederation Line was closed for about 24 hours or so, starting at about 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, between, I believe, Tunney's Pasture and Blair stations. The other thing that we saw that day was a small uptick in calls to 911. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that was related to road safety and fallen branches. By late afternoon, we saw about 65,000 Hydro Ottawa customers without power. The city's recreational, cultural, and facility services programming ended early that day at 4 p.m. to account for the road conditions and some power outage in city facilities. And our public libraries also had to close some branches early that day as a result of power outages. Before I talk about what the city did, I'll just quickly mention that the other impact that we saw and that we always see when there's a power outage is that there's a small increase in calls to Ottawa Paramedic Service. And this is from people who have lost power, but need it in order to function critical medical equipment such as ventilators. So in terms of what we did very quickly, when we saw that there was significant power outages, the city went into enhanced operations that Wednesday evening, and we started to prepare for community supports that may be required the next morning. And we knew that we wanted to open city facilities for people to access for device charging, showers, washrooms, that kind of thing. And so that was the focus of our plan and what we essentially did that Thursday morning. By 10 o'clock the next morning, we had made over 50 city facilities available to residents to access. And we were working very closely with both Hydro Ottawa and Hydro One to understand the extent of the impacts and how long the power outages might go on. One of the complicating factors that weekend was that it was Easter weekend. And so the Friday was a statutory holiday. So the focus of the city's emergency operations centers on the Thursday was really for planning very precisely the community supports we needed for the next day because we knew it was a statutory holiday. And that included making sure that city facilities continued to be open and that we brought in staff to open them. And then we focused, as we usually do, on some core community supports. Whenever there's multiple days of power outages, we start to think about wellness visits and we start conducting them. And we did that this time with the help of Ottawa Fire Services and also Ottawa Police Service, which was great to see. The other thing that we did, and it always happens in rural communities, I think I see Councillor Kelly still on the line. His ward was one of those impacted, but typically in rural communities, there are a lot of people on septic and private well. And so when they lose power, they also lose access to water. And so we made sure that there was appropriate distribution of bottled water at key locations in rural communities. And like we always do, we're almost like a well-oiled machine now, is we reached out to make sure with all of our partners that we had the right supports in place. And that included with the Food Security Task Force, which, as you heard in the March presentation, is chaired by the Ottawa Food Bank. And so they were on standby to provide any food security supports that may be required. Although because the power outage was relatively short in nature compared to the derecho, we didn't have to do a full mobilization. As always, the Emergency Operations Center relied on information coming from councillors. We really appreciated that you were amplifying city communications. And by the Saturday evening, power was restored to, I think, over 90% of customers, with the last mile being restored, I believe, Sunday morning, if I'm not mistaken. So we then demobilized the Emergency Operations Center and handed operations back to Public Works Department for debris management. And they're actually still doing that. I know GM Alain Gontier writes every Friday about his progress on that front. It's a lot of work. There was a lot of damage caused by this ice storm. Comme toujours, je veux toujours remercier les employés de la ville d'Ottawa qui étaient en certains cas eux-mêmes victimes de panne d'électricité, mais ils ont quand même continué de travailler et d'assister les résidents dans la ville. So we always have wonderful city staff. Even when they're impacted themselves, they continue to come in. Really appreciate councillor support, Really appreciate all the work done by, frankly, the heroes on the front line at the utility companies who work in such difficult conditions, and the residents and community groups who we know and we talk to. We see that they're out there helping their neighbors every time this happens, and we really love to see that. So I think I'll end there. Yeah, c'est tout. Merci.
Thank you, Director Gooding, for that verbal update. As I noted, we do have a delegate for this item, Ms. Christine Trautmansdorf, Executive Director for Volunteer Ottawa. Welcome. Good morning. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you for a few minutes this morning. My name is Christine Trautmansdorf, and I'm the Executive Director of Volunteer Ottawa, Bénévoles Ottawa. We're one of approximately 150 volunteer centers operating in communities throughout Canada, and one of about 15 in Ontario. Volunteer Ottawa grew out of the Social Planning Council of Ottawa in 1957, and we're one of Canada's largest and longest serving volunteer centers. Our mission is to strengthen the community by promoting volunteerism and supporting the hundreds of local charities and nonprofits who rely on the time and talent of volunteers to keep their programs and services running. Nous offrons nos services dans les deux langues officielles. I sat in on your meeting on March 30th to hear the presentation on the derecho report, and I know you will be getting an update today, or you've just had an update on the response to the April ice storm. The derecho report identified a number of areas where the city can improve its ability to prepare for and respond to emergencies, and recommended building a formal network of external partners to enhance collaboration before, during, and after an emergency. So I'm here to tell you about some of the ways that Volunteer Ottawa can be part of that external network of partners, and describe a few of the ways that I think we can help. I'm going to focus on 3 aspects of the recommendations: the volunteer management, communications, and public education. Volunteer management is obviously one of our areas of particular expertise. We operate a web-based volunteer recruitment platform that allows any resident of Ottawa to put up their hand and say that they want to help out. We have well over 12,000 detailed profiles of people from all parts of the city who are ready to help. We've had information about their skills and abilities, their availability, where they live, their email addresses. This is a searchable database that is used by our community organizations to find people who meet their particular needs. We also have a volunteer job board that allows nonprofits to post the volunteer positions they need to fill and accept applications online. So thousands of volunteers use that service every year to get involved in their community. Our volunteer pool is currently growing by about 500 people per month, and we're very actively recruiting new volunteers to meet the high demand for our community service partners. Our communication strategy is very focused on driving this recruitment campaign right now. Increasing the size of the volunteer pool and making volunteering accessible and inclusive involves lots of communications. About 9,000 volunteers receive our newsletter every month, and they're reading it. We have an incredible open rate of 45%, which is close to double the nonprofit sector industry standard. We're very active on social media with about 24,000 followers across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And our website is consistently the top Google search result for anything related to volunteering in Ottawa. We're also in constant contact with the city's community services sector through our newsletters, workshops, and services for nonprofits. The public education component of our work involves a wide variety of in-person and virtual information sessions and workshops for volunteers and staff in the nonprofit sector. These cover many topics, from how to choose a volunteer opportunity, how to get a police check, and targeted session for youth and volunteer newcomers. We're right now partnering with the Red Cross to offer emergency preparedness and opioid response training as part of our corporate volunteering program, and we're hoping to offer these more widely in the future. Our public outreach program includes lots of presentations to schools and community groups, and we organize 2 large volunteer expos every year, which bring our career fairs for volunteers. We bring about 50 nonprofits together and then open the room to the public so that they can come in and meet with them to find out about volunteering opportunities. Volunteer Ottawa is one of many volunteer centers in Ottawa talking to their municipal governments right now about emergency preparedness and response. I'm on the steering committee of the Ontario Volunteer Centre Network, which
One
was
minute.
asked to make a submission to Emergency Management Ontario on how volunteer centres can play a role in the provincial strategy. The OVACN submission highlights the way volunteer centres can share their expertise, their networks, and their services with municipalities in the province to engage community volunteers in emergency preparedness and response in ways that are efficient, safe, and well organized. To close, I'll come back to the derecho report recommendation on collaboration with external partners. In an era of tight budgets, limited capacity, engaging the expertise, infrastructure, and networks of organizations like Volunteer Ottawa makes all the sense in the world. It can take a little time sometimes to get that worked out, but I think there's the benefits, economic and social, are tremendous. And when it comes to volunteering, harnessing the goodwill, compassion, and skills of people who want to help others in a time of need has even greater benefits, not only in terms of capacity, but for the community benefits of connecting people to one another. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I'll see if my colleagues have questions for you. I'm going to assume most of the raised hands are for staff, but if you have a question for the delegate, Councillor Devine. Anyone else virtually? Councillor Johnson for the delegate and Councillor DeRoche. Okay. Councillor Devine.
Hello, Christine.
Hi.
You must have sang in a choir at some point because everything you said is music to my ears right there. So Christine, you and I were going to be meeting, I believe in a week or two, and I feel like I just had, part of the meeting right there. So I'm very, very, very enthused to hear everything that you're saying. I think I've mentioned to you that my community has been through several disasters where volunteers, certified or not, played an integral, if not vital role, in helping get our community back up on our feet. And Beth, I know that myself and Councillor Brockington are meeting with you at some point soon to talk about how we can mobilize, if not overcome, some of the hurdles for the city to get to engage and or steer resident volunteers, not staff, to respond to these various emergencies. And so, Christine, my question to you, and I think I know the answer, would you feel that Volunteer Ottawa, I assume you have the probably best position, and I appreciate the fact that you mentioned Red Cross, because I know that they are also a vital partner in training the volunteers that your organization can mobilize and organize and deploy. So question A, would you feel that Volunteer Ottawa has the capacity to properly sort out, as you say, a growing number of volunteers by skill set, by equipment they can bring to the field, by where they are and how they can best be deployed? So do you have the capacity to do that kind of organization?
Absolutely. The digital infrastructure that we've got in place can be expanded to incorporate all kinds of criteria that you might be looking for in an emergency. It's not an emergency focused database right now, but there's certainly, it's a matter of adding some fields and doing a search sort filter to deliver.
Absolutely. And based on the interactions you've had with your volunteers already, your large database, do you sense that there's a willingness among Ottawa residents to be involved in this kind of activity?
Absolutely. Human beings want to help other human beings in a time of need.
They certainly do. And knowing that from the city's end, the obstacles that I've encountered are the liability issues of the city directing a resident to be a volunteer in a situation. The city can bring the truck, the city can't just do, there's liability issues. Would you be willing to work with councillors and or staff to act as that intermediary should we need that kind of solution to overcome our liability concerns?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to that collaboration and the challenges of building external partnerships, those kinds of things have to be sorted out. But I think we have connections with all the community organizations, the not-for-profits. We can build connections with community associations, with community groups who need volunteers in a particular area, and hopefully take some of that load off the city services at a time when you're already pretty busy.
Yeah, what you are presenting is a solution to a problem. We have a vital need to build our resilience. We have thousands and thousands of agents ready to be deployed. We have obstacles because of legal issues and any other numbers of burdens we have, and you're proposing a solution. Thank you for coming here. Our meeting in 2 weeks just got better. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Devine. Councillor, this is your questions for the delegate. Councillor Johnson and then DeRoche.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you, Christine. I wonder if you could describe for the committee where your funding currently comes from.
Funding comes from a variety of sources. We do our best to do self-generated revenue. We have a membership model, so we get fees from not-for-profits who pay us a modest fee every year. We do the corporate volunteering that I mentioned that we're doing in coordination with the Red Cross. It's a program called VO Connect. So we're selling that coordination service to not-for-profits or to community partners, large employers. The one coming up in June is with Export Development Canada. We do a lot of education and training in the form of custom workshops, particularly. We do a little bit of fundraising. We look for sponsorships for our big event called the Voskers every fall. And we are a grant application machine. So we're looking for money wherever we come. We get we have no core funding. We have no funding from the city. We have no funding, core funding from any level of government.
Thank you for that. So what's coming up for me with this conversation is actually something that I put forward. All councillors had just been asked to contribute suggestions to our service review, and from the mayor's office and the two other councillors taking this on. And I think there is something to be considered when we are imagining if we're going to take a piece in-house and replicate it internally, and or ask Beth and Chris and her tiny staff to, become tech wizards or whatever we're going to ask them to do in this next phase of the emergency management regime. Often when we think of privatization, we think of, when we think of outsourcing, we think of privatization. And I think there is an opportunity here to think of outsourcing as actually being a different kind of partnership with our nonprofit sector. To be able to offer them some degree of core funding, operating funding, so that they might do the things that they do very well. It would require us to reconsider perhaps our locus of control when it comes to the city of Ottawa, wanting to make sure that we hold, for risk and privacy reasons and all those other things. But I might suggest that those aspects of community partnerships could be mitigated with the right will and the right foresight and the right advice. So I just wanted to put forward, thank you for, I actually didn't know the answer for your core funding, but we can see here that, you have a service that has no core funding, which means that you might be impacted in terms of your salaries and a talent attraction and retention and so on. And so if we do imagine this as a strong resource that it's already, as Councillor Devine suggests, creating a solution for an ongoing problem, we should be prepared to reimagine how we fund that, and actually might consider it an efficiency for the city of Ottawa, as opposed to a whatever we cast out all of our community funding programs to be, a nice to have. It might actually be an efficiency if looked at in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Desroches, and then Kavanaugh.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to the delegation. Listened very closely. I currently have the pleasure and honor of volunteering for St. John Ambulance in Ontario, which is doing some great work at a grassroots level to work with and collaborate with emergency services. And recently, this is in the public domain, the national office received a grant from Emergency Services Canada to set up a database so that if there is an incident or emergency that agencies can tap into that, so they can reach out to the volunteers and help. So the question was answered. My question is going to be are you looking at other levels of government for assistance? It sounds like you are. And, I think that's a great model that, that the federal government is playing as a role, because obviously, when we have a crisis, we have an emergency, it doesn't respect the boundaries of the city of Ottawa. So we could have something in the West End or the East End, and we need the collaborations across jurisdictions. So I think it makes sense that the province and the federal government are helping out, just as they are with the work that's underway with St. John Ambulance. So the question was answered, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate just a few minutes to speak to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Christine. Always a pleasure to see you. It's great work that you're doing, and I remember back in 2019 during the flooding, I talked to your predecessor and about the need of possible collaboration, because we had volunteers coming, to help with sandbags, et cetera, in my area and other areas. It was just kind of a little, I don't want to say chaotic, but it was just overwhelming. And it would have been helpful to have some sort of coordination. People just show up and they want to help, and we don't want to kill that spirit, but it just to make it a little more streamlined, I think it would be helpful to have that assistance and coordination. So I had talked to your predecessor about that and talked to Tony about it back then. And I think that should be considered because it's a source of volunteers in a hurry, and it just sort of streamlines it so we know who they are, and there's a database that I think that's helpful. Just to, when people have that urge to be, to help and be, do something good. I don't know if you want to make any comments about that.
No, it's music to my ears. I think the conversations around being using the capacity that we have to be organized both in advance, knowing who is available and who's contacting, and then being able to quickly mount a response strategy to say we need these volunteers here, and here. Knowing the people with the skills, getting the word out, that's a little bit of organization up front, and preparedness, I think, can do help a lot in terms of getting that kind of response and using the resources that are available to us in the most efficient way possible.
Anyway, I appreciate your delegation, and I think we've learned all about Volunteer Ottawa. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanagh. Any other questions for this delegate? Seeing none, thank you. I'm confident there'll be some follow-up with you soon.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Colleagues, before the delegate spoke, I had a list of speakers which I assumed were for staff on this item. My list in order is Councillor Dudas, Desroches, Kelly, Hill, Devine, Johnson, and Kavanagh. If you do not wish to speak or raise questions to staff, let me know. Otherwise, I will follow that list in that order. So Councillor Dudas, you're first.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you, staff, for the update. Absolutely. I feel like we're getting a lot of these kind of updates, whether it's floods, derechos, ice storms, and we're going to expect to get more. I guess what's concerned me a lot, since particularly after the derecho, was we always hear residents have to be ready for 72 hours or 3 days. 3 days of being prepared to fend for themselves. I want to know, and I know you're not going to have a hard and fast understanding of this, but what percentage do you think of Ottawa's population is in that position, that they are ready for 3 days or whatever Mother Nature or, weird emergency disaster is going to happen? How many do you think are actually in that position that they know enough to be able to fend for themselves for 3 days?
Thank you, Chair. Great question. We don't have those metrics with regards to the percentage. Unfortunately, my professional opinion is that it's relatively low. I don't think that the educational programs out there are providing enough. They're providing information, but we're not hitting enough people to actually do this. In fact, even city employees don't have a 72-hour plan, and those who know and who should have in the past come to me and said, wow, I never even thought of that. And I'm going, it's all over the place. How could you not think of that, right? So, but that's because I'm living it. And I think that we need to do more to help people prepare and to be ready for that 72 hours. So there's some work to do there. I'll pass it on to Beth, who can also add a few comments.
Oh, okay, thank you. And again, Chair, excellent question. I would agree with Kim. The other thing that we always want to highlight, and I kind of sound like a broken record every time I come here, but emergencies disproportionately affect vulnerable members of society who are least able, because of things like inflation, cost of living, to have these resources at home. And so that's why it's so important for us to work with our social services partners and to have neighbors helping each other, such that the people who aren't prepared are able to get some support anyway.
I appreciate that. And you really you really went right to the heart of what, or I was leading with that question, and that I don't think that most people, equate a disaster and having to be prepared for 3 full days. Most people are like, okay, I can do a day, 2 days max. And then after that, we're just all at a loss. I understand that there's a lot of work being undertaken by our volunteers in our city, by our emergency personnel, by OCH, by, OPH, by Hydro Ottawa. I guess what I want to kind of leave this part with is that we need to have not only that response. I know we're doing the work to kind of prop up that Are You Ready program that the city offers, but I think constant, continual communications and education. Like regardless, we could go 3 years without anything, knock on wood, right? We could have no disasters for the next many, many years. Here's hoping. But we should constantly have milestones where we're educating the public, where we're working with those more vulnerable communities, but everyone in general, because the fact is that it could happen in the blink of an eye. And it's always better to have more people who either own a generator or have bought that extra freezer and can preserve their own food or know where they're going to go if they have to leave their own home. Because the fact is we're going to have to be ready for this. It's going to happen more often. And I think having that really equipped population will mean that you guys are less strained when it comes to the boots on the ground. So I'm once again, we've talked about that ad nauseum, but I do think that there's a huge component of just getting people ready and prepared on a constant basis for what is looking like going to be inevitable situations.
Thank you, Councillor, for that. Councillor Dorosh and then Kelly. Councillor Dorosh.
Thanks, Chair. I did hear during the presentation, and I'm glad they raised it, that with the recent event, there was a certain awkwardness because Friday was Good Friday and it was a statutory holiday. And I hope that we're, taking that as a lesson learned. Councillor Gower and I were both approached or both observed that, as things came back online on Good Friday, the grocery stores couldn't reopen, the hardware stores couldn't reopen, and people wanted to get back and replenish and repair. And the answer was, well, we don't have the ability to give that kind of exemption. Your tourist area, we can exempt that. But to get back on your feet, we can't exempt that. So I think there's a gap in the legislation to give grocery stores and hardware stores the ability, or at least the mayor give him or her the ability, or them the ability to open. And again, residents shouldn't have to leave their community again to get back on their feet. So I'm glad you've noted that. I hope that's on the radar. And I guess that's my question: is this on the radar? Because I think this really, create an exposure for us that we've got to work with the province. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. So excellent question. It is on our radar. It's one of our biggest lessons learned from the April 5th freezing rainstorm. It's that statutory holidays do make things more complex for us and for residents. We have a lot of opportunities to discuss our observations, in particular with the province, because we have regular engagement sessions with them. And so, yes, we will be raising this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I know Councillor Gower and I are looking at helping advance this file. I hope Councillor Brockney will consider bringing it up at AMO potentially and down the road. I think we're probably not the only ones in that situation. There's always an awkwardness when you get into these open on holidays. The Labour Council was opposed to the Glebe opening many years ago, went to the OMB, and that's a whole different set of circumstances. I think in these situations, I think we'd all be in agreement. I hope that people need food security, people need to sort of repair their homes, and having a holiday really is an impediment there. So thanks for that. I'm glad to hear that it's going to be a point of focus going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dosh. Councillor Kelly, you're next, and then Vice Chair Hill. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to Beth and her team for all the work that you do. And I know you were busy preparing the three reports for today, and so I just wanted a couple of things that came out of the ice storm for me, particularly in my ward, because most of the city is served by Ottawa Hydro, which we are the owner of. The vast majority, I think over 80% of my ward is serviced by Hydro One, and we don't seem to have any official relationship with them or channels for a counselor to work through or some sort of liaison with Hydro One. And I was wondering if that's something that the city is working on establishing, or would that be up to individual councillors in wards where Hydro Ottawa is not the predominant provider of that service? That's my first question. And then I'll let you answer that before I ask my second question.
Thank you, Chair, for the great question. So we found that our relationship with Hydro One really was enhanced during the April 5 freezing rain event. They were regularly calling into our Emergency Operations Center meetings and sending us updates when they did shift changes so that we had a regular contact to reach out to. And so we're seeing our relationship improving every time, and we want to build on that. We're not aware that they have a formal council liaison function, but that's something that we're happy to raise with them. The other small challenge with Hydro One and why we don't give regular statistics on customer outages for Hydro One is that they don't group their data by Ottawa. They tend to group it by region. And so when they give us statistics, it can include many areas outside of the city's purview, like Kemptville, for example. But yeah, that's something that we're working on, and it's an excellent suggestion for us to ask about that going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. That would be most appreciated. If there's anything I can do to be of assistance there, that would be helpful, because it is kind of frustrating because so much communication comes out from Ottawa Hydro and so little of it is relevant to my ward. The other aspect of it, and I'm sure this is something you've heard over and over again from rural councillors, is when there is a natural disaster or some event where people's power go out, internet and cell service is a huge barrier to being able to help people and get information to them. So, and the experience I had as a new resident to Constance Bay, funny 15 minutes down the road where I was living previously, the cell phone service was great. But down in Constance Bay, it's horrid. And so when everybody's power goes off, we lose access to Wi-Fi. Everybody goes on the network to use their data. And I actually just learned last night at a disaster preparedness event in my ward that when something like that happens and the power goes down, that there is bandwidth sort of put aside for emergency services. And that's one of the reasons that we see, individual use and the ability to use the network being hampered slightly. So, and even at the community center in Constance Bay, because West Carleton's so large, there's no one area where people can go. There's when a large scale event hits the ward, like the ice storm and everybody's power went out, there were people in every community in West Carleton, which I will remind people is the size of the city of Edmonton. So you might have cell phone service at one community center, but another one, it's very spotty and you got to walk over to the window to make a call, and your iMessages don't work and all of that. So is there any solution to that, like a portable or a quick emergency solution, a van with a satellite dish on it? That's my tech knowledge doesn't go very farther than that. So is there any mobile or emergency service that could be deployed to enhance cell phone and internet access during an emergency?
Thank you, Chair. Again, another excellent question. And you're right, Councillor Kelly, it comes up a lot. So there are a couple things I wanted to note here. And I have to say that I'm not an expert at all on the first one, but we can do some follow-up. So my understanding is that there's a specific rural internet initiative led by our IT services department and Recreation, Cultural and Facility Service that are looking into enhancing access to Wi-Fi in rural areas. And this is where my expertise stops. I don't know the specifics of the program, but we're happy to put your office in touch with people who do. From a rural perspective, the connectivity issues are a bit more challenging. In the city, what we're doing for our community support centers to make sure that anyone who uses them can not only charge their phones, but access the internet while they do so, is we do things like bring mobile Wi-Fi pucks to the centers and make sure that we have that connectivity. But I'm not sure to what extent that works in a rural area that doesn't have the network to begin with, you know? So what I will commit to doing is following up with your office on that specific project that I mentioned first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Looking at my list here, Vice Chair Hill's next, then Councillor Devine. Councillor Hill. You're fine? Okay. Councillor Devine, then Johnson, Kavanaugh, Lula, Desroches.
Thank you, Chair. And Beth, thank you for sitting in that chair. Every encounter I've had with you in my short time here has been inspiring and reassuring. From all the exchanges we've had, I know that you are a real champion for advancing how we respond to this. And I very much appreciate how you're throwing yourself into all of this, the challenge that we're facing. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Councillor Dudas was talking about our need to build our resilience, you know, for people to be ready for 72 hours. It follows the same kind of messaging that we had in a recent briefing from Hydro Ottawa, where they know that we can forecast that these events are happening more and more, and that we have to build our resilience as a city, as communities, as individuals. And I'm going to reference a line I saw in one of the coolest action movies ever, where some director of emergency, something, the kind of guy that just never smiles at all, ever, a line he said was, hope for the best, plan for the worst. And I really do love that line. It's not a cynical line. It's a pragmatic line. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. Hoping for the best is hoping that more and more and more people will do what they need to do to be ready for 72 hours. As you said, Kim, the number is likely small, you know. Planning for the worst is what do we do with the knowledge that that hope is a little bit futile. So in order to ameliorate that situation, because I think we can improve the numbers of Ottawans being resilient for 72 hours, because we cannot immediately come to the rescue of everyone. What I'm hoping is, and planning at the same time, is that our calm strategy is, as Councillor Dudas was saying, this can't be something that we put out a messaging once per year during Emergency Preparedness Week. This kind of messaging is most effective when it is regular and periodic and consistent. That will pound the message home. But the other thing that Councillor Dudas was raising, which is correct, I was just saying all that you said before was fantastic. The other thing that Councillor Dudas was saying earlier is that it is true that there are many Ottawans that are more prepared to handle these kinds of crises than others. And there are many that are far more vulnerable, that do not have the means to either escape the city or to provide for themselves. And so what I'm hoping that comes from our comms strategy, the way in which we communicate this strategy, is that it is not only something that we pound home all the time on a quarterly basis or whatever, but that's truly directed at the communities that need the help most, so that they learn what they must do or where they can find resources. And finally, just on the knowledge that we cannot guarantee that everyone will have enough water or food at home, or that everyone will have a generator. We would never want the city to have 1 million generators sitting in garages. I think the other strategy is that we concentrate resources at, you know, strategic locations, so that knowing that not everybody's going to plan for 72 hours, we can make sure that there are areas where they can go, because they will go look for help if we point them to where that help is, and that those areas are properly resourced. Question mark.
Thank you, Chair. So everything you said was wonderful, and I agree 100%. I would take it a step further, because we're trying to do a few things here. As we discussed in March, we're also making sure that we map the vulnerable neighborhoods and not only the neighborhoods, but the specific buildings so that we know where we can find people. And then the other thing that I really think is important and that we're trying to do more of is engagement with community associations and other organized groups. And I'll give you a quick example. Todd Piper and I, so Todd is the manager of the Office of Emergency Management. We met yesterday with a Christian ministry associated with the Met in the Chair's Ward. And they wanted to work with the city to deploy during emergencies and help different neighborhoods through their network of churches. They're already doing wellness visits in retirement homes and things like that. They're distributing food. They're doing asset mapping. So they're on their own. They're figuring out who has a generator, who has a freezer, who has food, you know? And I think that it's such an important force multiplier and something that we need to encourage. It's the concept of those community hubs helping each other, you know?
Well, I love maps. When you talk about all of this, I'm very excited to hear about the mapping that you want to do. When you talk about mapping vulnerable areas and mapping vulnerable buildings, can you give me a few examples of what you mean by mapping vulnerable buildings?
Yeah, and so we're, thank you, Chair, again. We're starting simple. We're just putting data points on a map. So where are all the Ottawa community housing buildings and other buildings of that nature run by other entities? Where are the, we have data, for example, on socioeconomic factors. So where are the lowest neighborhoods from a socioeconomic perspective? So like I said, just data points on a map to start, but eventually what we'd like to do is turn that into a bit of a heat map that's a little bit more sophisticated and gives a better sense of what's going on. We're also working with the clerk's office. They have a great accessibility office that has put us in touch with advocacy groups for the elderly, for example, and they're telling us that they have good data on apartment buildings, retirement homes, and things like that that may be more vulnerable during an emergency. So those are the types of data points that we're starting off with.
Great. I'm sure we can all agree that having that kind of data, having that kind of information are useful tools for you to have and how to properly respond to an emergency. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson, then Kavanaugh. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you very much. I wanted to reflect a little bit on the ice storm. And yes, again, thank you so much for all of the extra attention that you were able to pay the residents of College Ward during this time. But I think we did come up to an interesting situation whereby, you know, Bell's Corners didn't have the most appropriate city facilities in the area. And I just wonder how we're going to strategize moving forward for areas that are not properly served by current city facilities. I mean, in this situation, there were city facilities, but they were all offline. But I think we've talked a little bit about maybe some other approaches to get help to those neighbors that, you know, can't easily travel into other neighborhoods for support.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So excellent question. These are really great questions today. I can share that the Office of Emergency Management is looking into this issue, and Bell's Corners is a good example of where our community facility are not optimal, to be frank. So we're looking at a couple of things. I can share that I am in discussion with the school boards to see if there are opportunities for us to utilize their libraries and learning centers as community support centers during emergencies. And they seem very open to the idea and happy to explore a memorandum of understanding. Now, obviously not all of their schools have appropriate generators and that kind of thing. And so it's not a, you know, panacea, but it's the kind of option we're looking into. And if I mention the Christian ministries that we spoke to yesterday, they were also very interested in seeing if churches would be good options for people to access. And so I think this is a perfect example. And I keep on using this word, it's a bit of a cliche, but it is that force multiplier. The more external buildings that are willing to open their doors to the public, the better it is for residents, especially people who may have mobility challenges and prefer to stick close within their neighborhood. And so those are just two examples of the types of relationships we're trying to develop. And many thanks to you, because that was, again, one of our big lessons from the freezing rainstorm.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Kavanaugh.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation. One thing, I have the same issue as Councillor Johnson in terms of a center, because there is no adequate center. Everybody thinks about Roncobus Lakeside, but it's never used because for one, it was right in the middle of the flood. But the other thing was that in other emergencies, it doesn't have showers or any facilities such as that. It's basically a rental building facility. So we have the same issue, and it just points to that we need more recreation facilities in our community. But obviously in the short term, we're looking at other things, and schools are a good idea. So I appreciate that. In response to Christine from Volunteer Ottawa, I wonder if there's been any consideration to look at Volunteer Ottawa for coordination for emergencies, but also maybe not so much emergencies. They're a well-run organization for getting volunteers for short-term, like for certain events. Has that ever been considered?
Thank you, Chair, for the great question. So we do have actually concrete examples of us using organized volunteer entities to manage spontaneous volunteers, including Ottawa Volunteer Search and Rescue, which is an excellent entity operating on both the Gatineau and the Ottawa side. They did that kind of work actually in 2019 with the spring flooding. And so it's an excellent model, and it's one that we actually prefer to deploy. It's very efficient. So yes, we'll be looking at that further.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh. And Councillor Luloff is next, and then Donosh.
Thanks. How do we prioritize cleanup efforts following a major event, just generally, like as far as like areas and whatnot?
So thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question, and it's becoming an expertise of our Public Works Department. My understanding is that they always start, they always prioritize public safety issues first, major intersections, and then after that, they prioritize based on the context of the debris at hand. I don't know if Kim wants to add anything, but that's what I've learned through the many debris management efforts that we've supported. Yeah.
Is there a way, while an event is ongoing, to publish a schedule of those priorities so that people know when to expect help in their neighborhood?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the question. Yes, we are actually trying to make more of that type of data available in real time during emergencies. And so we will add it to our list.
When you are prioritizing, is it considered that rural areas do not have the same amenities within walking distance as suburban areas or urban areas?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So rural areas present unique challenges because of the distances involved. And that is where partnerships with schools and other facilities in those rural areas are going to be really important. What we're trying to do during an emergency is reduce the travel time for impacted residents. Not only can it be stressful, but it can be hard in terms of gas and things like that.
Is there a single person or department right now that's coordinating efforts to build those relationships with churches, schools, businesses that to build that force multiplier capacity?
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. So yes, that's us. That's the Office of Emergency Management. Having said that, though, Recreation, Culture, and Facility Services has long-standing relationships with some entities, and so we rely on their expertise as well.
Is there like a single point of contact that's doing that, or a single cell that's doing that right now that's like tasked with that work?
Yes, thanks again. So it's the Office of Emergency Management that's tasked, if you will, with that work. Yeah.
Okay, great. Perhaps we might be able to get an update on how that work is going midway throughout this term. How How did the freshet impact response to the ice storm, and how difficult is it to manage multiple events at the same time, given the capacity that we have?
Thank you again, Chair, for the excellent question. It's difficult and challenging to sustain multiple operations at once. We have our Public Works Department doing that right now. In addition to freshet, they are still dealing with the debris management from the freezing rain. And I believe that they're doing some just remnants of derecho in terms of tree planting and things like that. It's also very difficult to have two emergency operations centers running at the same time. And so this is kind of an excellent discussion about resource management within the city, the need to build additional capacity and emergency management across all departments. I know that GM Alain Gontier is, for example, looking at augmenting emergency management knowledge amongst his staff just because of all the debris management work he has to do. And so I think these are important discussions that are happening citywide. And it's a really pertinent question. I don't know if Kim wants to add anything. No? Okay.
I know that residents in my ward, especially in Cumberland Village, were incredibly impressed with the work that was done in setting up that emergency response group in West Carleton. Kudos to my colleague, Councillor Clark, Councillor Kelly for the work that he's done to help build that capacity. They were so impressed with it that they started setting up their own group. They've got the fire department at Station 72 involved as well. Which has been wonderful. And in fact, when we did a call out for volunteers, we had a lot of off-duty rural firefighters come out to help us out. What do you think that Emergency Protective Services can do to help bolster that work? Is there any thought being put into maybe coming out and engaging some of those community associations and helping to set up those groups, creating those connections? I know that individual councillors are doing that work, but perhaps there might be an opportunity to do some outreach between now and the next inevitable event.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for the question. So I agree. Some of the work being done by organized volunteer groups in the West Carleton area, including West Carleton Disaster Relief, the Mennonites and the Christian Ministries, is amazing. And we want to encourage people to look at that as a positive example. We are right now doing a lot of community engagement. This year, we have released our Community Emergency Management Toolkit, which helps communities build their own emergency plans. And we're kind of doing a roadshow by going to community association meetings, other types of events, and giving briefings and talking to people about how they can organize themselves. And so we're happy to do more of that going forward. And like I said, I think that groups can learn a lot from the activities of entities like West Carleton Disaster Relief, which are kind of a leader in this regard.
Yeah, they're doing incredibly impressive work, and super glad to see that they're inspiring people, across the city to be able to help bolster those responses. I understand that when you are dealing with two emergency situations at the same time, having that backstop of dedicated volunteers to come out and help out makes a big difference and helps to expedite things. By the time the city crews arrive, some of the work is already done, and maybe it's just the heavy equipment that they need. You've got a ready labor force there ready to help out. I think that's really important, and it's important to recognize that these volunteers are doing that great work. So thank you to all of them. I was particularly glad to hear in your exchange with Councillor Kelly that we're looking at enhancing internet access in rural areas. I think that there's quite a few different technological options out there for us, things like Starlink and whatnot that will be able to help out. It is so difficult to get information out when there's no power, as networks are completely overwhelmed. Traditional wired networks, there's no power to serve them, and so people rely on their cell phones. As soon as my power goes out, I lose my internet on my telephone, and so it's difficult for me to get information out to residents, and it's certainly difficult for residents to share information with each other. So anything that we can do in that regard to bolster that network access, I think will go a very long way to being able to communicate that communication that's desperately needed during an emergency situation. not a lot of people have wind-up radios to be able to tune into things like CFRA. And we found that, during the massive power outage that we had post Dureco, when we turned into some of our, AM radio stations, they were playing a baseball game. Not particularly helpful during that time. So we have to be able to take that into our own hands and get that information out to residents. So glad to see that work is ongoing, and looking forward to seeing what solutions you come up with. Thank you very much. That's it for me, Mr. Chair.
Great points, Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Delaroche.
Thanks, Chair. And my questions and comments come up from an exchange with Councillor Clark on Wi-Fi. And we don't have Wi-Fi at many of our facilities. That when you talk to staff, they say, well, they're kind of small. Well, they're not small on the weekends. They're not small in the evenings. Maybe they're small during the day, particularly in the suburban community. So this is, as part of our strategic planning exercise, this is something I think we can accomplish this term of council if we work together. We can expand the Wi-Fi capacity in more of our buildings, public buildings. And I have feedback from the public saying, "Are you kidding me? Like what? Like it's like 2023. You don't have Wi-Fi out here. What's going on?" So, and again, we've set this up in terms of a partnership, and I think we might have to look at the model. But is this on your radar? I mean, obviously, this is more than just texting. At a hockey game, this is when we have emergencies. That these are centers for people to recharge and get back on the grid and connect with their family. So, is this on the radar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. So it is on our radar, partly also because we know that when people visit a community support center, it can be a bit boring for them, and they probably want to access the internet and do things like that. What I also want to highlight, though, so yes, it's on our radar and we're looking into it, but I also want to highlight that it's really important in emergency management to look at low-tech options. And so I think Kim Ayot mentioned this the last time, but another initiative that we're looking into is whether going forward, we could send text messages to people during an emergency. Those tend to be low risk and safe in terms of their ability to get through. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I like the exchange with Councillor Johnson that you're talking to the school boards, and that certainly resonates with me in my ward, where we don't have a lot of recreational capacity at the present time, but we do have schools. And pleased to see that you're opening the door there. I hope in those conversations that the boards are friendly to the idea, and this is not a rental arrangement, right? You think of 9/11 and what Newfoundland did. The philosophy was we open the doors to the people in need, and it's legendary what they did in that situation. It wasn't we're gonna rent you space here. So I really hope that they view this positively. And again, it's not a rental arrangement. It's people opening the doors to families that go to their schools when they're in need. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. My question to staff is, when we received the Dureco report a couple months ago, which identified gaps and areas for improvement, I think there was a commitment that this committee would receive an update. And I just wanted to clarify when that would be. When do we get a status update on the work specifically identified in the Dureco report?
Thank you, Chair. Those updates usually come when we do the annual reports, and we provide that. If you wish to have them earlier than that, then we're at the will of the Chair.
Yeah, I think that we'll talk offline, because I think there's a desire to get an update probably before the annual update, which would be about a year from now, I guess, since we're doing it today. So we'll talk offline.
And thank you, Chair. And just on the point of a year from now, we certainly realize that putting the annual reports in May during flood season has been extremely stressful for staff and public safety. So we're going to look at perhaps doing it at a different time of year. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a completely different subject matter. I think I heard Councillor Kelly talk about this when he referenced Hydro One, but to my colleagues who are served by Hydro One, is there not the same contacts or infrastructure base within Hydro One that Hydro Ottawa has, where there's a liaison, councillor has a direct contact with someone at Hydro One? There are open communication channels when the power goes out. I'm seeing no, and I can't believe that's the case, but I think staff committed to reaching out to Hydro One and emphasizing the importance of establishing these critical contacts.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We are in constant communication with them to try and improve the information flow to not only the residents, but the councillors.
Is this item received? All right, thank you very much. Thank you again to staff on that matter. Okay, item 5.2 is the Public Safety Service 2021 and 2022 annual report. Again, I'll look to the GM and director.
Thank you, Chair. We'll just, the presentation will be up and I've already provided my opening remarks, which address this report as well. So I'll pass it on to Beth.
Okay, thank you. So we can, the agenda, we're just going to give a quick overview of the services provided by my area and do the usual report highlights and look ahead. So there are, if we just go back a slide, I think, there are 4 teams under the Public Safety Service. Todd Piper manages the Office of Emergency Management, which is the one you're probably most familiar with. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but what I will just remind you is that the province of Ontario has a piece of legislation called the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. And there are requirements for municipalities related to emergency management under that act. And so it's that office that is responsible for compliance with provincial legislation. And they provide the framework that supports the city's broader emergency management program, which, as we discussed before, includes every department and service. It's everyone's responsibility. Our corporate security team is managed by Clayton Foster, and the mandate is to provide physical security services for city facilities, assets, and people. And I'm not going to read through all of the activities they do, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. Just as a reminder, our security guard services are a contracted service, and they work out of the 3 admin buildings. You will have interacted with them before and during council. We do have permanent employees who are focused on security advisory services, and it's kind of like a bespoke service that they give to city departments. They're assigned a portfolio of departments. They work very closely with them to provide different security services. So as an example, they'll do a security audit of a facility based on crime prevention through environmental design principles and identify, risks and make recommendations in terms of mitigation efforts. They'll provide advice on systems and support installation efforts, and they'll support things like investigations, among other activities. Another thing that they do, which is really important, is training. Our security and emergency management systems team is managed by Catherine Zuccato, and they are most closely linked with our corporate security team because they largely focus on the city's corporate security systems. So things like CCTV, door access, intrusion alarms. All of those security systems together comprise the city's integrated security management system, which is overseen by our 24/7 Security Operations Center located at BFP. Ben Franklin Place. And then last but not least, we have the Public Safety Systems team, which is managed by Denny Cutt. So that is the home of the 911 service level agreement with the Ottawa Police Service, which we've discussed. But he also manages the city's public safety grade corporate radio system, which is a critical communications tool for our first responders. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to provide some very quick highlights for each service. Couple of things to note about corporate security in terms of the environment in Ottawa. So obviously, Ottawa is a large, dynamic city. We have over 1 million residents now. We're also the seat of the federal government, which means that we see more demonstrations and protests than any other city in Canada. And there are direct linkages in some cases to city facilities. So for example, a lot of protests and demonstrations like to start and end at the Federal Human Rights Monument, which is just outside City Hall on the Lisgar side. And so that's something that we monitor closely. In terms of the context, because Ottawa is a large city, it obviously has its proportion of crime and social dynamics like substance abuse and things like that. But what we've noticed post-pandemic is more polarization, more incivility, and higher levels of anti-government sentiment, which in some cases translate directly to threats against elected officials, including at the municipal level. And so these are some of the factors that we're considering as part of our sort of threat context. And this slide here just provides you with a high-level overview of the reported security incidents at city facilities over the past 2 years. And as you can see, in most cases, they are increasing. Next slide. So very quickly on the corporate radio system, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a critical system. The corporate radio network is a Bell Mobility radio network, but the city manages the contract and the user requirements, which are varied. So we have a lot of internal and external users, all with their own needs. A good example of this is that this team has been working a lot over the past few years on building corporate radio infrastructure into our LRT stations. And this is a really important functionality. In fact, it's the only reliable communication system in LRT. So that's just something to note in one of the projects they work on. There are some external users as well. For example, the Canada Border Services Agency uses our network at the Ottawa Airport. Next slide. OK, donc il y a eu beaucoup de situations d'urgence durant les dernières 2 années ici. Je peux aussi souligner le fait que dans certains cas, les situations étaient assez complexes. Donc, on est très, très fiers de nos employés du Bureau de gestion des mesures d'urgence. Ils sont excellents, mais je pense qu'il faut aussi noter qu'ils sont fatigués. C'est difficile d'être constamment dans une situation d'urgence. And so that's really what I wanted to highlight here is that the city has been through a lot, and we're very proud of the team that supports these emergencies. Next slide. That's actually a good segue to the next slide, because what we're saying here is that despite all of these situations, so it has not been a normal 2 years, but despite all of these situations, the Public Safety Service has been able to deliver on its core programming. And I just want to pause and thank all staff of the Public Safety Service. It's such an honor for me to work with them and see the excellent work that they do every day and their commitment to the programming. And so that's really something I wanted to pass on as a key message. The other thing I wanted to mention here, I think most of it's obvious, but that in addition to the emergencies that we had over the past 2 years, some of them required inquiries and audits. And so that actually is quite a lot of work for my service as well. I think I personally was interviewed at least 4 times for the audit of the city's response to the convoy protests. Staff had similar experiences. We submitted a bunch of documents. We worked on management action plans. And so it is a significant amount of work to go through those important processes. Next slide. And that's really our look ahead. We want to make sure that we deliver on the recommendations, including on those that we made ourselves from the derecho AAR, which was noted by the chair. We're also really proud this year to be a part of the city's anti-racism strategy. We have 2 deliverables specific to emergency management. And again, I will sound like a broken record, but I always say that emergencies disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of our population, including members of equity-deserving groups. And so we're looking forward to working on our deliverables. We also want to do more strategic things like develop a new emergency management strategy. I think the discussions at this table highlight the importance of the city coalescing around core priorities, for example. And we want to formalize the mandate of the corporate security program through a new framework. And Next Generation 911 speaks for itself. I think that's our last slide. I think, je pense que c'est tout. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that overview and the annual reports, and to align with comments already had this morning. Certainly in my earlier years being a Boy Scout, the theme was be prepared, and it can't be more true that the city has gone through a lot the past few years, and being prepared, as many have mentioned, is something I think this committee can focus on to prepare the public and residents for all types of incidents. So thank you for that report. I will recognize the Vice Chair first, Vice Chair Hilton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Beth and Kim, for the report today, for all of the work that you've done in preparation for this and for the team over the last several years. You know, that one slide with the numerous incidents that you've seen just over the last few years just really highlights the good work. You know, we may not be able to predict when the emergencies are going to happen, but I think Ottawans can have good faith that when those things do happen, there's a pretty awesome team behind Ottawa and the emergency management group that are willing to jump in and do the business. So thank you very much to you and your team. My question is about the slide you had on the trends, the security incident trends. I was just curious, is the increase from 21 to 22, is that look like a genuine trend increase, or is that because there was an anomaly with COVID in 21? And how does that kind of backtrack through, you know, 20 and 19 and 18 in terms of trajectory? And is that something we should be concerned about and should be, you know, engaging on to perhaps inform future decisions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the excellent question. It is hard to be precise in the response because you are right in that 2021, we suspect, was an abnormal year because of the remnants of the COVID lockdowns. And so there was simply less activity at city facilities, for example. So I think what we'll have to do is continue to monitor the external context, look at our statistics, and make better inferences going forward on what the trends really mean, you know. Thank you, though. Yeah.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. So, you know, having looked at that list of events that your office had to deal with from 2 years, many of those events, I hope, knock on wood, are the unpredictable anomalies that we likely won't see too often. But some of those events, all of those weather events, are the predictable, unfortunately predictable events that we can anticipate. And so I guess my question is just in anticipation, in the knowledge that your office has to have oversight and management of such a wide array of emergencies, and with the knowledge that you will likely have to be focusing more and more attention and resources on weather-related anomalies, how will that predictable significant increase in weather events in the years to come affect how the public safety service office is able to conduct their overall work and scope? Will you need to either broaden your scope or at least attract more resources to be able to manage all of what you do?
Okay, thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the excellent question. We're doing that analysis right now in terms of what the program requirements are going forward, especially after the types of situations that we faced over the past 2 years. I can share that, you know, per employee during emergencies, the Office of Emergency Management does more overtime than any other employee within the Emergency and Protective Services Department. And so that's something that we need to consider as part of our analysis. And so, like I said, we're assessing our requirements. And if we do need additional resources or any kind of change in programming, we'll be submitting a proposal as per normal during the regular budget process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I don't see any other hands. So the motion before us is that the committee recommend council receive this report for information. Is this item received and carried?
Carried.
Thank you. Item 5.3 we've dealt with in the 911 reports. Item 6 is in-camera items. I don't believe there are any in-camera items. There are none. Item 7, motions of which notice has previously been given. Councillor Devine on behalf of Councillor Kavanaugh, inventory of generators and high-rise apartment buildings. I believe there have been some modifications to the actual motion. And Councillor Devine, I'd ask you to read the therefore clauses if you may, please.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, the motion has amended significantly over the last few weeks in concert with staff. So as for the therefore clauses, and then I'll I'll just deliver my remarks on it. So therefore be it resolved that Ottawa Fire Service staff develop and provide committee with a scoping document to create an inventory of residential buildings 6 stories or taller in Ottawa without generators, including any associated costs, no later than Q4 of 2023. And therefore be it further resolved that councillors be surveyed in the development of the inventory, as they may have information about buildings in their ward, so as to help formulate a comprehensive list. So Chair, colleagues, a few months ago in this room, when we heard a briefing about the derecho, Councillor Brockington raised the potential for a nightmare scenario of what might happen if we had an extended power outage during a period of extreme cold or extreme heat. And last month's power outage after the ice storm got us closer to that scenario than I hope that we should ever be comfortable with. My colleagues know that this isn't the first time that I've appealed to you for action to address the vulnerabilities of residents who live in high-rise buildings that don't have emergency backup power. And over the past few months, I've been working to advance more pragmatic solutions to this problem. And what we have before us today, I believe, is one of those pragmatic solutions. What this motion is seeking to do is to provide our emergency services with a tool. And really, all this current motion is doing is letting our emergency services investigate what it would take to acquire this tool. And that tool is information. And as we just heard recently, not too long ago from Beth Gooding, during an emergency, having reliable information in your toolkit would enable our first responders to make the critical decisions they need to prioritize their responses. So in my ward, there's a road where there are 2 high-rise buildings right across the street from one another. One has a generator that can power the elevators and the water pumps and the emergency lighting, and the other one doesn't. So let's say there's an extended power outage and it's minus 30 degrees out. If you were managing and deploying our city's first responders, and if time was of the essence and you had this information in your toolkit, I propose that this kind of information would help you direct your teams where to go first. We know that we're going to get more of these extreme weather events. Hydro Ottawa has told us they'll be more frequent, they'll be more powerful, and at some point they will happen at the worst possible time. It is reckless for us to think otherwise. I have discussed this motion, Councillor Kavanagh and I have discussed this motion at length with Ottawa Fire Chief Hutt. Not only is he supportive of the motion and supportive of the objectives of the motion, he helped craft this motion into its current state. If I have his support, I hope that I have yours. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Devine, for introducing this on behalf of Councillor Kavanagh. And I would like to recognize Councillor Kavanagh next, and then I have a speakers list. Councillor Kavanagh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Councillor Devine for introducing it on my behalf. Appreciate it. This comes back to 2018 when I first went into apartment buildings that did not have generators and came across people who were absolutely terrified. I was just becoming a councillor. I was going door to door, and I was in a building where it was 21 stories, and they had not had power for 3 days. They finally did get their power back. So no elevator service, no water, not an ability to flush their toilets, etc. And many had accessibility issues. I found it frightening. I couldn't believe that this was happening. And I felt very strong that I had to do something. But I quickly discovered that these issues are related to building code, which is provincial. And I know that that's been tried to be dealt with at the provincial level successfully in Toronto. But it's about doing something about having generators in buildings that do not currently have them. And I should say that Ottawa Community Housing does, by the way. As chair of Ottawa Community Housing, I'm very proud to say that our buildings do have generators, our high-rise buildings. So that's where I first became concerned. Our colleague from last term, Councillor Eglai, moved a motion as well last year about the absence of backup generators in large residential buildings, and which left the elevators out of order and cut off water supply as well. this is something that he found problematic as well. And to quote the Hydro Ottawa's CEO, he found it shocking as well and called it almost borderline criminal. We've known this for a long time. And it occurred to me that the one thing that we could do is find out where these buildings are and be able to give that information to our emergency services as an aid, so that when we have these situations, they can put an extra effort because they'll know in advance that there's no elevator working. These people have had no water supply, that they have the tools they need to aid people who are in emergency situations during a power outage. And we've seen some pretty close calls. It's quite amazing that we have not had any serious incidents. So this is why I wanted to work with Chief Hutch. I spoke to him. He was very supportive of this. And he just needs, as has been outlined by Councillor Devine, they need some time to put this together. But many of us do know of the buildings in our areas. It's usually the older urban areas that are directly affected by this. And it's not all buildings. Most condo buildings have generators, for example. So we need to work together and give our emergency services the tools they need to help residents in need during power outages. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And I just want to ask the general manager if he has any comments to share at this time on the motion. I know Chief Hutt is not able to join us today. He's attending the funeral, but General Manager, if you can add anything, that would be great.
Thank you, Chair. I did speak with Fire Chief Paul Hutt, and he did indicate that he was involved in drafting this motion, that they would like to scope out the work. That being said, I also believe that there's an owner's responsibility, a social responsibility to do the right thing. And what this list may do for us is be able to approach them and see what their plans are in the event that there's an extended power outage and they don't have a generator. So what is your plan to deal with the residents, which are your responsibility, not necessarily before it becomes an emergency? And that's the point. We're looking at a system here to provide, first of all, let me say that fire services already does pre-planning for a lot of our big structures in the city, but they look at it from a fire suppression perspective. So if there's a fire in a structure and there's no power, et cetera, how do we actually walk through it? Where are the hazards? How do we get people out? How do we evacuate them? So they already do a pre-plan exercise for every building. One of the things that's missing in that pre-plan exercise is whether or not there's a generator, not necessarily for the purpose that you're looking at it for, because most buildings will have a generator for the elevators, for emergency services, to go up, but they're also limited timeframes on those generators. So they don't last for days and days and days. It's basically evacuate and help rescue people. So all that to say, Chief Hutt says he's willing to scope out the work. I think it's a little bit more comprehensive than people think, to actually look at what it takes to do this work. And and I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that context. Okay, Councillor Kelly, questions. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And, as someone who just spent the better part of a month dealing with an emergency in my ward, I certainly understand and I'm supportive of tools that would help us identify vulnerable people who may require assistance during that time. And thank you to the Ottawa Fire Service who did quite a bit of that work in Ward 5 over the last 3 weeks. And I think they're well equipped to do that work and have the manpower and the processes in place to do that. And I just have some generally supportive of this version of this conversation, particularly in the absence of any partisan stuff. And I just have one question, though. It's in regards to the 6th whereas clause. So whereas it would be helpful to emergency service teams such as fire, paramedics, and emergency management to know in advance and share information on which of these buildings have generators and which do not. The word in there that not necessarily concerns me, but I would like to know who they would be planning on sharing that information with. And I'm not sure whether that's a question for the mover or for Mr. Ayotte, perhaps. Just generally would like to know what that means, who that information would be shared with. And because in my experience, the fire department did their rounds and wellness checks in Ward 5 during the flood, and would then pass on information about vulnerable individuals, not to community members or local organizations due to privacy concerns, but to Ottawa Public Health, EMS services, so that there could be a deployment of the proper resources to support that individual. So just want to get clarification on where that information would be shared and with who.
Perhaps I can start with that, with the answer to that. Thank you, Chair. We would share it with our emergency responders. So if fire was to take on this work and they would collect the data, we would also work on a method so that paramedics could access that data, so that police officers could access that data. It would not be our intention to share it publicly. However, I can't speak on behalf of the mover, so I'll let the mover speak to that point.
That's exactly the intention of what was meant. If it requires an amendment to share with emergency service, that was always the intent. Thank you.
Councillor Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly trust that is the process. I'm just, so if I can confirm, maybe Mr. Ayotte could confirm that this information would be subject to the same rules and regulations that all of the individual and personal information we receive as a city does right now. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yes, I can confirm that just like we collect a lot of information on a lot of buildings across the city, and we don't openly share that except to our emergency partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ayotte. Thank you, Chair. I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dudas, you are next.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to understand that, I know we're talking about scoping out the work, and then, the next step would be then creating the list. How would this work in real life? So if emergency personnel have a list, they know that a building in particular doesn't have a generator and others do. Do they actually prioritize that building over something else? Like, is this an actual feasible way to address the needs of maybe some of our more vulnerable buildings and residents within it? Would you be able to use this in a way that would actually see a change in how you respond during these emergencies?
Again, this would be a coordinated effort through Director Gooding's group with regards to an emergency that's declared in the Emergency Operations Center. What this would do is give us information that we could share with those emergency responders to identify which buildings are most vulnerable. So which buildings have the most vulnerable population, and then we can prioritize our response to those buildings. Right now, we're responding to buildings, if you will, haphazardly, in that we'll just take 911 calls saying, I'm stuck in my apartment, I have no water and no way to get out, and then we'll respond and we'll help. This would allow us to be more coordinated from a, having the data perspective. And even during recent emergencies, we've been advised, we've been asked, okay, which buildings, how can we prioritize this? And it made it very difficult. We prioritized primarily by vulnerable population, but we didn't have all the data we needed to actually make some of those decisions. So this would be a more global kind of city response to how we would respond to this. We would also consult with our friends at Ottawa Public Health and paramedics, et cetera, to say, we're seeing this as the most vulnerable building to deal with right now. So here's our priority list. And they would confirm that based on their knowledge of the data that they have as well. So that's how I envision it being used. It wouldn't necessarily be used on a day-to-day operational basis like our pre-plans are, but it would be something that would be very valuable to the Emergency Operations Center as a whole to make those decisions.
No, that's excellent. And having more tools to be able to help people in our community, we should try to promote that and have more of them. I think this motion is excellent. I'm happy to support it. I thank you to the mover, and I thank you to Councillor Kavanagh, because I think this walks that line of, maintaining people's privacy, but identifying those who might need the help first. I appreciate this being brought forward, and I'm going to be supporting it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Judas. Councillor Lula, if I have you next. do you want to go or?
I'm good. Sure.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Hill, you're next.
Thank you very much. Just to confirm how this synchronizes with the previous motion that was submitted on the 13th of February. To clarify that discussion, I'll read out the second, therefore be it resolved from that, which was that the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee recommend council direct staff to review Toronto's minimum backup power guidelines for multi-unit residential buildings, voluntary performance standards for existing and new buildings, 2016, and then to report back in Q3 2023 on the resources required for the preparation of an Ottawa version of such a guideline. So my understanding from what we're doing here is that this is kind of wrapped in that, but specifying a specific action in order to work towards that.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm not sure. I do see them as two separate things. As I understand it, the already approved recommendation for staff to pursue a similar document as what Toronto has. And as I understand it, that document, if we call it, let's say the Ottawa version of the Toronto document, would be to prepare recommendations and guidelines for how Ottawa buildings could develop emergency backup power. That's a separate thing. What this is here is really just to have a list in anticipation of that day that one time might come where we have backup power. In anticipation of that, this just provides emergency service responders with a list of who's vulnerable, who's not. So until we get to that point, then we can properly respond. I see them as, yes, they are all serving the same goal, which is how do we address the vulnerabilities of these buildings? This is a preliminary step to just make sure that we can make sure how to best respond in case of an emergency. I'm still hoping to push that other work forward.
No, thank you very much. That's clear. And I would just confirm perhaps with the clerk's office that this isn't a reconsideration or that there's no technical issues that trip over each other with this motion.
Mr. Chair, I can confirm it's our opinion that this motion is neither in conflict nor a revisiting of the previously approved motion.
Okay, no, I'll be supporting this motion. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Councillor Hill. Councillor Kelly, you had your hand up. You're now down, so no issues there. Okay, Councillor Kavanaugh.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to for clarification, even though some of us have anecdotally seen the situation in these buildings, I thought it was important to know the scale of the issue, and not for me, but for emergency services and fire, and that's why I approached Chief Hutt about it. That this is useful information, and frankly, I don't know how many buildings are out there don't have generators, but I know in my own area, but it's useful for them, and that's what it was all about, to find out the scope of the issue and make sure that they were prepared. And I appreciate the cooperation of General Manager Ayat and Chief Hutt on this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lulav, your hand's up, but you're fine. Yeah, you're fine. Okay. Councillor Devine, do you need wrap up?
I hope not.
Okay, so I'll call the question then. All those in favor of this motion? Carried. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh and Councillor Devine. We appreciate that motion. Notices of motion for subsequent meeting? See none. Inquiries. We do have an inquiry from Councillor Gower, which will be read by the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The inquiry is as follows. In light of the recent incidents surrounding dog bites and attacks within the City of Ottawa, there has been an increase in safety-related concerns within the community. Can staff please provide the following information? 1. What is the typical time frame for pursuing a court order to seize an aggressive dog? 2. In recent years, how often has bylaw and regulatory services had to pursue that course of action? 3. Has there been an increase in the number and severity of dog bites or attacks since the pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So that is noted and staff will reply in time. So thank you for that. Are there any other inquiries? Seeing none, any other business? Seeing none, before you leave, I have a few announcements to share with you. So first, next week, May 21st to 27th is Paramedic Service Week. The week celebrates paramedics, communications officers, equipment and supply technicians, educators and trainers, quality assurance staff, and all other support staff who provide the day-to-day life-saving services of medicine's frontline. This year's theme is diversity in paramedicine. On behalf of my council colleagues, I want to thank each one of the Ottawa Paramedic Service team for your hard work and dedication and wish you a wonderful celebration. Au nom de mes collègues du Conseil, je tiens à remercier chacun des membres de l'équipe de service paramédic d'Ottawa pour leur travail acharné et leur dévouement, et je vous souhaite une magnifique célébration. In early June, the 5th to the 13th, fire prevention officers will be going door to door for the spring wake up campaign to check to see if smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms are present and working. Get a working smoke alarm on each level of your home and outside each sleeping area. Colleagues, please schedule enough time in your schedule for our next meeting, June the 15th. We have a significant agenda that day. The Ottawa Paramedic Service will bring forward their 2021 and 2022 annual reports, as well as the investment plan for 2024 through 2026. We will also have the corporate bylaw review work plan for this term of council and the on-demand accessible taxi cab service study. This does provide for a busy meeting for the committee with some important topics of discussion, so please plan accordingly. After the June meeting, we will break for the summer and return in September. We'll have the Ottawa Fire Service 2021-2022 annual reports, the Fire False Alarm Bylaw, Ottawa Fire Services Volunteer Firefighter Employee Status, and the one I know you all been waiting for, the Clothing Donation Box Bylaw Review, which has been discussed for some time. So we have a busy few meetings ahead of us, so I wanted to provide highlights in that case. We've had a good discussion at today's meeting. Seeing that there's no other business, this meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.